Hey everybody, today I am here with my old friend, Warren Neidich. I don't even remember how far back we go, but back into the 2000s or 90s or something like that. And Warren is a artist who's had a long, august career. And recently he's gotten interested in kind of cognitive activism, maybe not recently, cognitive capitalism. And he is putting out a new edition of his book, The Glossary of Cognitive Activism. And we met recently and started a discussion around it. And I was excited actually by how many of our interests kind of overlap and kind of fascinated by the book. Sort of like, it's almost like a novel in the form of a glossary, I mean, or theoretical treatise in the way it uses kind of the glossary form to kind of develop a whole, yeah, kind of like perspective on what's happening to us as technology evolves and capitalism evolves. So I thought it'd be really fun to just, yeah, to talk with Warren about the book, jump into some of the kind of the different categories and ideas, and kind of the theoretical framing. And yeah, Warren, when we were speaking at lunch, I think what really kind of like made me feel that I really wanted to have this discussion with you is when we were talking about the Google mapping and the impact it might be having on people's hippocampus and its brain. And then you kind of launched into some soliloquies around like sort of brain architecture and so on, which was a little out above my pay grade, but I was really excited to see the way you were thinking about this stuff. So let's start a little bit. What was kind of like the genesis for this project for you?
We're talking, just to get back, we're talking about the Glossary of Cognitive
Yeah,
Activism. What was the genesis of that? Well, you have to understand that this Glossary of Cognitive Activism is the fourth edition of the Glossary of Cognitive Activism, and it started in 2015. And what it was really a guide to an artwork that was showing at the Kunstforum Rosa Luxemburg plots, or sometimes called L40, in Berlin, in which I had a piece called the Statistikon Neon, and I also had the Pizzagate Neon. So I was showing two large pieces. One was called the Statistikon Neon, and the other was Pizzagate. So the original Glossary of Cognitive Activism was a guide given to spectators who came to the show and wanted to know what the words meant that they were looking at. So that's how it started, and it was much smaller. It was a thin volume, and in that glossary, I explained the words that were in on the Statistikon diagram. So as you know, but maybe some of your listeners don't know, but they can go to my website or Instagram and they can see that I'm in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working with large neon sculptures. Sometimes they're on the wall like a fresco, and sometimes they're hanging like a chandelier and like a suspended sculpture. They're all in neon, so they're all about light, and they're text based. And there are white arrows going in between the words that kind of create a web-like or network function that allow everything to be connected. So that's basically how it began, as a guide for spectators coming in to see my exhibition. And then it continued from there. It's an iterative process. Like I'm even thinking I'm having nightmares that I've forgotten certain words in the last for the last venue. So it's iterative, it's changing, it's growing. It's also some of the words that were important in 2015 are no longer important. So I had, it was very much 2015, 2016, I should say 2016, was very much about the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and some of the things that had happened. Like, so fake news was huge during the 2016, the first glossary. Things like keck, things like meme magic, these kinds of words, which were part of the general elocution of political philosophy in the 2016, are no longer important for the present volume. So it's iterative, and there are words like ChatGPT, which is much more important, algorithmic governance, algorithmic bias. These are some of the words that are much more important today, but weren't included in the first volume.
Yeah,
And
so yeah,
I should also mention that the glossary became an entity in itself. So at first it was entangled or linked with my sculptures as a guide, but in the third and fourth edition, they became something on their own without a direct reference.
so it's kind of an organic development.
Yeah.
So I mean, but okay, so that's kind of, the art you're involved with, but I mean, I'm trying to get more into like the meaning of it. Like, what for you is cognitive capitalism and what is cognitive activism?
Okay. Well, let's go through cognitive capitalism. So, cognitive capitalism is a designation of a political philosophy that was an outgrowth, really, out of a certain group of Italian, what were called post-Operismo political philosophers that were living in and around Milan and Trento and Bologna. And they would be people like Toni Negri and Franco Berardi and people like that. Silvia Federici was very important to that. Paolo Verno, and they were basically developed this concept of cognitive capitalism. I should also mention Jan Moulier-Boutang in France, who wrote a beautiful book called Cognitive Capitalism, who argues that cognitive capitalism, this is Moulier's argument, not mine, but Moulier argues that there was that as a result of the integration of cybernetics into labor, that also was part of the transition between Fordism and post-Fordism. The idea in Fordism of an assembly line, the idea in post-Fordism as an idea of feedback and feed-forward and feedback loops within the workspace, the nomadic workspace, rather than the one incarcerated to the assembly line. These kinds of ideas were going to affect how we understood labor and what labor and the politics of labor and what it would mean. And they were the prequel to all of the things that we're talking about today, like performative labor, the knowledge economy, information economy. All these things were emerged out of the discourses of people like Maurizio Lazzarato, for instance. He was another member of that group. And in 1980, he wrote one of the most important essays about immaterial labor, that immaterial labor would become the most consequential performative labor that didn't leave a trace, labor that was about the growth of knowledge, would become more important than the labor that produces objects. And that was the moment in 1980. Of course, Moulier-Boutang says 1975, but I would argue that Maurizio Lazzarato's famous article.
Let's not get into much of the weeds. Let's we're probably talking about
Excuse me.
A lot of the just like let's try to stay. I mean, and your book is very good. I mean, you have a lot of theorists, and it's fascinating. But I think people can get lost in the weeds. I mean, immaterial labor is super interesting. I mean, I read about that in Negri and Hart's work.
Sure.
And they talked about it as like what's ultimately being produced. So immaterial labor is everything that's like digital and virtual, like media, design, where you're not like making a car,
it doesn't leave a trace. The beautiful example of immaterial labor is going to a rock concert. And the laborer, the virtuoso pianist or the virtuoso guitarist is laboring. And yet when the crowd leaves, the only thing that might be there are empty Coca-Cola cups and cigarette butts, but there's nothing produced. And I'm arguing that immaterial labor is actually material because it's affecting the brain. It's affecting the material connections that are occurring in the brain. It does leave a trace, in fact, that immaterial labor, even though it's not about objects, it's not built on an assembly line. It's performative. It's about theater. It's about public relations. It's like the public relations.
For Negri, I guess their whole perspective was that it's about the production of subjectivity, right? That
Of
like
course, yes.
in postmodern society where immaterial production has become like the hegemonic form of production. It's the production of subjectivity is the most important thing that's being produced.
And we're all cognitarians. We go from being proletariats working on assembly lines to cognitariats working doing performative labor in front of screens and clicking and swiping screens, creating data, and that data is not passive. So that's also a transition. So the idea of immaterial labor has changed from 1980 to today. So, but let me put it in perspective. I'm sorry, I would like to clarify. There's an early stage of cognitive capitalism and a late stage. So the most important thing about cognitive capitalism is that we are no longer proletariats working on an assembly line, but we're cognitariats. We are mental laborers. That's a key component. We're no longer physical laborers working with our bodies on assembly lines or, whatever. We are, and, that goes all the way back to the early 19th century with Eugene. I want to stay focused. Okay. Otherwise, I could go deeply into this. But anyway, the bottom line is that the cognitariat or the mental labor exchanges places with the proletariat or the laborer using their body. Now, that's not to say that physical labor is gone. Physical labor has just been subsumed by mental labor. In other words, we are still for instance, in Brazil making cars. And in Eastern Europe, BMW makes its cars, and still physical labor is still happening, and although it's happening very, very different in a more postmodern way, where the worker has a say and the worker gives feedback to the managerial and all of that, but it's still physical labor. But now mental labor has subsumed, and you know that because all of the investments that are being made today are in Google and Microsoft and all these all these chat GPT and all these kinds of
open AI and stuff.
yeah, it's all about that. So we know that. Now there are a number of other characteristics of early cognitive capitalism. So there's an early stage and a late stage. And the early stage is, like you've mentioned, Tony Hart, Tony Negri, Michael Hart, Lazzarato, and all these other people. And they argue that there are 5 components to that. And this is a summary. First is that the labor is precarious. That in the past, labor that people worked for one company their whole life. There was a sort of stability. There were safety nets. You had insurance. You had a 401k. There was basically you had more stability in your life, and there was more assuredness. Now we're on the end of a precipice. Your job could end at any particular time, but people are also changing their jobs quite consistently. They're moving from one job to another. So there's this idea of precariousness, precarious labor. And that is something that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. Then there's the idea of 24/7 labor. We don't have weekends anymore. Everybody's working all the time. And that's called the third element, which is called real subsumption. And by the way, Jonathan Crary wrote a book called 24/7, which really goes into it much deeper. And he actually talks about 24/7 as a kind of the commodification of sleep. But I'm not getting into it that way. I'm just saying that, we're working all the time. On the weekend, we met our first time on a Saturday. But what did we do? Some people would say that we were working. We were talking, and here we are today. But it was on a Saturday that we met, right? So there's no such thing as a weekend anymore. And also part of that 24/7 is that, I had a meeting this morning with curators that live in Stockholm. So they're on a 6-hour difference. And and then the other day I was having a talk with somebody in Korea, which is a 12-hour difference. So there's this idea of this kind of the linking of time and labor, that labor can happen any time now. It's not formal. It's not formatted to a specific 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. or what 8-hour day or whatever you want to call it. It's part of our real life. It's labor is life. Okay. That's the third thing. So this real subsumption, that labor is life and life is assumption. Then we already talked about immaterial labor, that labor today is performative. We already mentioned that already. It doesn't leave a trace. And I argue, of course, that it does leave a trace. Then there's the idea of communicative capitalism, that so much of our industries have to do with technology and media. So and then there's also another one called the financialization of capital, and that has two meanings depending on who you read. On one hand, financialization of capital means that the economy is psychologic. It comes and goes based on feelings and attitudes that a group of people have, and that's what's pushing the market. This kind of different kinds of psychology. The other idea is that there is the person working is actually investing in the same funds as the owner, so that there's no longer that breakdown. So that's pretty much early cognitive capitalism. But then
What
there's a late one too. Okay, go on, tell me.
what is the what's the time frame associated with these stages?
Well, the stages would be, that's what I'm saying. So Yamulie Butang would argue that 1975 is the beginning of cognitive capitalism, but I'm arguing that Maurizio Lazzarato in 1980, that fundamental article that he wrote would be, for me, the beginning of cognitive capitalism, when it really comes into being.
Perfect.
And then the late stage is something that I have been writing about since 2015. And I think other people now are accepting this later stage. So therefore, so 1975. But of course, one more little subtle tweet sidebar is that cognitive capitalism emerged out of a group of political activists called Operismo, which was a result in 1965 even. So you could even say the roots start in 1965 with the Operismo group and their relationships to the Fiat plant and the Olivetti plant. So it depends on how you want to look at it. But basically, there's a different. It's like the Anthropocene. When did the Anthropocene start? Everybody has their, different date when the Anthropocene starts.
I guess when you say late stage, it kind of suggests that there's going to be a transition into something else.
It's already started. It's already,
modernity,
the late stage is already happening.
and there was post-modernity. So what happens after a late stage cognitive
There is a
capitalism?
the early stage transitions into the late stage because we are moving into what I call a neural economy. So that what happens and where what happens is that this immaterial labor, there's a number of things that happen to these definitions. Let's take immaterial labor. So immaterial labor is now not so immaterial because I'm arguing that it in fact does leave a trace. It does that the new commodities of this moment we're living in, probably after 2015, but certainly continuing today, are neural based, and that the immaterial labor is actually changing the course of or changing the reactions that are occurring in the brain itself at the neural synaptic junction, but also its extracranial aspect too. So the brain for me is not just something that's incarcerated in the bony skull and is something that's crystallized and doesn't change and is a product of genetic changes in the course of a species. It is also a result of situated in an extracranial component, meaning that it interacts with the world around the social, political, economic, historical, cosmological conditions of which it is mirroring, and it's a mirror. And that since 2 million years ago with Homo habilis, that technical changes, that changes in the evolution of techniques. This is Bernard Stiegler's argument that the history of changes of the techniques, and what I mean by that is not just simply technologies like spear points and spears and fire and social hunting and slash burning agriculture, all these kinds of things. That it's not just those kinds of technologies, but it's the social technologies as well. As you might know, we have the social networks and social media today, and and we have Facebook and Instagram and all these other social. They're technologies as well. They're not just the interaction of human beings and their way that they evolve. It's very entangled with technology. So those changes that occurred in the last 2 million years are having fundamental changes in the brain too. This is all again Leroy Gowan, and it's also Bernard Stiegler. The frontal lobe has expanded, as well as the temporal lobe with language, 1 million, and also the parietal lobe and their connections to each other, whatever. So that expansion is a result of epiphylogenesis or exosomatic organogenesis, as he calls it. It's not. Those are Stiegler's terms. So this is all very important for late stage cognitive capitalism, because this immaterial labor, which was a fundamental aspect of the early cognitive capitalism, now changes, and actually we understand it to have effects on the brain and material effects. It's material, and that we understand that the neural common, the common of the neuroplasticity, that was something that is God given and given to all of us, like water and breathing and air and all that stuff, is also a fundamental place for commoditization and capitalist expansion. And that is what's called neural capitalism. And that's one of the key aspects of late stage cognitive capitalism. The other aspect of it is called neuropower. So, everyone knows what biopower is, the famous, expression of Foucault about power over the body. Of course, Foucault was the person who really understood that this biopower was really geared towards making human social interactions better. It was actually something that he tried to understand in a positive way, but it does have its negative implications. And that biopower, populations of bodies and how they're instrumentalized, how subjectivity is organized, how processes of governmentalization impose themselves on the body, like a woman's right to choose is a perfect biopolitical statement. Of course, today we understand it in a much different way, as it's now under threat again. The Alabama Supreme Court arguing today on the news that an embryo used for artificial insemination is protected by law, and that it is a human being already, even at that point. So there you have that's what biopolitics means, when politics affects the body and what the body can do. And I'll get into that later. Again, I want to talk more about that. But neuropower, which is part of late stage cognitive capitalism, is about populations of brains and how process of mental is in the middle of that word, governmentality is in charge of how that the pharmacon, the positive and negative, the emancipatory and the despotic aspects of how new technologies are affecting the neuroplasticity of the brain, what I call the neural common. Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess I still see a little bit of a distinction between, pre-cognitive capitalism and cognitive capitalism. I mean, there's still a distinction between making chairs or umbrellas and kind of rewiring the inner dimensions of brain function. I was curious about neural economy.
Well, of course. I mean, for instance, in Marx's idea of things like abstract knowledge and the connection, the way that the assembly line organizes human beings into set regimes of physical activity, and that there's a connection between the general intelligence, the basic knowledge that is available to everyone at any particular time, and the labor, how that changes. Yeah, I mean, there are definite, the idea of the brain and this idea of the mind in cognitive capitalism has its roots, back into the 19th century, absolutely, if that's what you meant.
I'm curious. I wanted to get into this idea of neural economy. You said you're saying that we're transitioning from the late stage of cognitive capitalism into something different, and then you use the term neural economy to kind of describe that. So can you explain what that means exactly?
Yeah, what I was trying to say, and this is another thing that I'm talking about in the journal, not the journal, but the journal, recent article I wrote in the journal, but in the Glossary of Cognitive Activism, is that we are transitioning into a neural economy, or what I call neural capitalism, in which new technologies that have far-reaching effects on our brain and its mental component are making their appearance. And right now, they're very their effect is just beginning, but in the future they will become predominant. So one example, what are some examples of that? Brain-computer interfaces is one thing that right now it seems very, very temperate, excuse me. But it has far-reaching consequences that make me shudder. So, for instance, for those out there who don't know what brain-computer interfaces are, or don't have a really strong idea of what it is, there are brain-computer interface, or such as the company called the Neuralink. There are other companies as well, but Neuralink is a good example. Allow for a person, for instance, who's paraplegic in a wheelchair to be able to use their brain waves to move a wheelchair or to move a robotic arm to feed them and to give them a slight sense of independence. Now, it turns out that the brainwave goes into an algorithm, and the algorithm turns it into a series of commands, and that you can train someone to use these brain waves, to do such things. Well, if right now we are capable of doing that, and we understand the rapidity at which technology changes, we know that 10 years from now, I'm just throwing that out. I mean, I'm just saying 10 years is a possibility, that 10 years from now, an external agent will be able to use those same codes that allow the brainwave to be decoded and turned into a sort of work, which is the robotic arm moving to feed somebody. Those same algorithms, or same decoding mechanisms, could be originating from an external brain, or what I call an artificial connectome, or a chat GPT connected to a neural link, or whatever you want to call it. We don't know really what that is, but and then could generate code that could penetrate the skull and intercede in the normal neurophysiological functional rhythms of the brain, modifying them, changing them in such a way that harkens back to a saga even more fearing than 1984. And then, of course, what would happen if that same external entity, whatever it is that when we're imagining it, it's like science fiction, but we live in science fiction. How about if that entity now was used in a child or an adolescent during critical periods of learning, in which the neuroplasticity is the most sensitive, and called critical periods, also sensitive periods of heightened neuroplasticity, when different parts of the brain are developing. One could argue that this entity could in fact change the architecture of the brain. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Then I was also talking, that's one example.
No, but I liked your example, and it really stuck with me when we had lunch around the hippocampus. I mean, so essentially, if you look at capitalism historically, we can see that all these things that people just used to be able to do for themselves or in their communities are ultimately outsourced and turned into markets, then sold back to them.
Right. This is the idea that I gave you about GPSs.
Yeah, so people used to obviously make food together. Now they go to restaurants. They used to go to the spring, which is now Spring Street, and dip their cups in the water and drink fresh water. Now they have to get Evian or Fiji water. They used to tell stories around the fire. Now they watch Netflix or TikTok stories. So there's been this progressive kind of like alienation where we and going deeper and deeper over time. So it feels like we're now at this next threshold where capitalism has kind of exhausted all these exterior markets. And
exactly.
the same logic is going deeper into the realm of subjectivity and the realm of sort of cognitive abilities that really define kind of the individual self, at least of the last centuries, if not for far longer. So we're looking at things like AI, which is going to like supplement or supersede people's reasoning capacities. Like instead of
And
writing a
creative
paper,
capacities.
what's
Yeah.
that?
And creative capacities.
Yeah, so instead of writing a paper comparing Walter Benjamin and Shakespeare's ideas, you just hit a button and it'll spew out something that's like that, which you'll hand in. And similarly, as you said, the hippocampus, I guess, forms when we're between like 10 and 15 or reaches its full functioning. And kids are kind of supposed to get lost, right? Like they play together, they go to the forest, they get lost in the forest, and they have to be like, how do we get home? It's like that tree and that flower, and they find their way back. And so they learn how to orient spatially. But if you have these kids from a very early age who are just doing everything with Google Maps, their hippocampus may never really develop properly. I think that's what you're saying.
Well, yeah. What I was saying to you that morning at breakfast is that what's happening is that I had noticed personally, and you would agree with me, that a greater and greater population of adolescents and young people are, don't forget they're not with their parents anymore. They're on their own. They use their GPSs to go everywhere, and they never learn wayfinding. Now, wayfinding is a very complicated um, it's a very complicated cognitive ability, and it relates not just to the hippocampus but also to the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and it's a whole network. And it's a kind of skill that is you learn basic skills, and then on top of that you learn other skills, and on top of that you learn other skills. But what I was saying is that certain aspects of wayfinding adolescents never really engage with because they are using their cell phones and they become dependent on their cell phones to the extent, especially during critical periods of development. There's actually two periods of development, but most children are not having. I mean, they may have their iPhone, but between 2 and 5, which is their first development of their neuroplasticity, but they don't have iPhones and they're not going to places by themselves. But teenagers are, and there is another developmental window, another critical period between 12 and 15 years old, and during that critical period of development, they are depending heavily on their iPhones to the extent that they never learn how to wayfind. They don't learn that skill. And then and not only do they not learn it, but they don't learn that they don't develop the neural networks themselves. They don't develop as well. So, for instance, to give you just to make a slight aside before I finish up and say what is the idea of that statement, I will say that there's been a lot of research done on London cab drivers, some who use GPS and some who don't, and it turns out that those who use the GPS never have much smaller um, uh, posterior hippocampuses than those who do not use them. Okay, so that was just a little aside. So what happens is that these kids, they never develop the correct connections, and the critical period goes, between 12 and 15. They grow beyond that, and they don't really have the chance to really develop those network connections. And then, just like when I went on the Guardian's website about 3 days ago, because a friend of mine said to me, "You need to read this article. It's incredible." So I went over to the Guardian and on my internet it said, "Sorry, I've already read 10 articles, and that I have to start paying for them now." Just so I assume that in the next 5 years, within the next 5 years, the same will be true for GPS, so that these kids will be dependent on this device. That's what I was saying.
And then another issue, I guess, after we spoke, I did some more research. I mean, some people who wrote about this issue were saying that the hippocampus is not only responsible for like spatial, wayfinding, but also for memory in general. Like there was the whole thing about the memory palaces in the Renaissance, where when people wanted to really learn how to remember a lot of stuff, they would create an internal spatial architecture. So that somehow there's a relationship between, memory and kind of the capacity to navigate in space. So I just find this very interesting because it's like you kind of feel that there are all these sort of like subtle, sometimes not so subtle kind of deteriorations going on in the sort of collective consciousness field right now, which is tough for me because I wrote a book about, the Mayan calendar and Hopi prophecies, and I was kind of hoping that there would be a sort of, that there were people like Ken Wilber, I don't know if you know his work, Spiral Dynamics, these ideas that we were going to see this evolution of consciousness, and instead it feels we're seeing the opposite. There's this like, sort of regression happening, and we're losing kind of our moorings in a way with, the social, the sort of onslaught of fake news and AI and all that stuff. But yeah, so I mean, it does feel like it's becoming a more of an amnesic society in a way, although anything that anybody ever says on social media or any mistake they ever make is like permanently embedded in the sort of cultural system. So there's also not like there used to be, you could sort of like, make mistakes in your life and then get past them. Like now you'll always be like, pointed back to that, it seems like. So yeah, none of these things seem very positive. I'm kind of curious. So let's talk a little bit about.
So it is. Before you go on to that, not to be Pollyanna-ish, I would like to say that I did write a text about telepathy, in which I argued that in the future we may develop organs of telepathy. Many of us have inklings of telepathy now, and there are some people who are, one might say, are telepathic more than other people. There's a variety of that skill. It's on a continuum. So I wrote a paper, and I was very interested in the work of a neuroscientist named Stanislas Dehaene, who's at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and he came up with this very interesting theory called the neuronal recycling hypothesis. And that neuronal recycling hypothesis is a very Stiglerian idea, or Stigler knew the work, and they each know each other's work. It's very, very much part of a French philosophical tradition. And basically, what he was saying, Dehaene was saying, was that if you look at somebody today and they are reading or writing underneath a fMRI machine, you will see an area in the left fusiform gyrus, which is in the posterior temporal lobe at the junction of the occipital and temporal lobe. You will see activation in that area. And he was arguing that something like this, something of this phenomena, given that we've only had writing and reading for the past 5,000 years since the beginning of the cuneiform text in the Tigris-Euphrates area of Babylon, how could it be possible? If you talk to any molecular geneticists, they would argue it would take millions and millions of years for that kind of change to take place in the brain, where you would have a module dedicated to reading and writing. Now, of course, it's not only in that fusiform gyrus; it's a network as well. It just so happens that seems to be the area where the preponderance of that ability is, but it's spread out to the frontal eye fields and again the parietal lobe. But generally speaking, there is an area, and so he came up with this idea, which I used for my idea of telepathy, but I wanted to explain it a little bit more. He came up with this idea of this neuronal recycling hypothesis, and he argued that in the brain, or the brain itself does not have to create new areas of specialization from scratch. That it, in fact, can use under certain kinds of accumulation. This is where the kind of Marxian idea, ideas of Marx and comes into play as a philosophical idea rather than about economy, that as a result of accumulation of extensive reading materials. So at first, yes, they were reading and writing was just used as a part of the cuneiform tablets to do taxes. But then it spread out. it spread out to the fact that there was more language was and reading and writing was used in more and more like governmental documents. Then people started writing books, and then of course we have the Gutenberg galaxy, the Gutenberg press, and the whole idea of the Gutenberg galaxy, and this whole idea of literature and books and everybody having a book. Anyway, all of this accumulation of writing and reading material put pressure on an area of the brain called the fusiform gyrus and transformed it from a previous module that was used by mocks to read each other's facial grimaces. So many of the components of facial gesticulations that are used to communicate emotional and aggressive postures and things like that, many of them have in certain ways certain basic components of the way the letters look. So anyway, through all this pressure, this is his theory, not mine, the area of the fusiform gyrus was transformed into an area for reading and writing. So I'm arguing, going back to Neuralink and brain-computer interfaces, that when you think about, for instance, Google's new device for not virtual reality, but augmented reality, you realize it's like everyone hates those goggles, So there's a pressure to go to the next level, and Elon Musk and other people have argued that when they were trying to develop these reading and writing machines, that the only thing that was holding back thinking was the speed of technology. So basically, there's a lot of desire to create these new augmented neurotechnologies. So anyway, getting back to telepathy and why there might be positive things, why it's a pharmacia. Yes, there's a lot of negative possibilities, but there could be hypothetically some positive capacities, so that in the future, Neuralink and ideas like that will be used for all kinds of things. It won't be just used for a person who's in a wheelchair, but it's going to be used for communication. It's already being used on the battlefield. There are special telepathic helmets that allow different kinds of messages to be communicated between soldiers on the battlefield. There are already Neuralink devices being used in gaming already as part of it. And so all these things are evolving, and soon there'll be an accumulation. I believe that Neuralink and things like it will be preponderant. It'll be everything that we do will be telepathic, using these at first telepathic technologies, but then the technologies, just like language and reading and writing, in the case of the fusiform gyrus, there'll be a pressure and accumulation of these technologies to such an extent that they'll change a particular part of the brain. What that part of the brain is, I'm not so sure, but there could be a similar phenomena. So I always joke, we all will become telepathic. So there's an example, something a little different. That's all.
But I mean, I guess the pushback would be that we already are telepathic. We just don't quite know it.
I'm saying that some of us have great. No, I don't know. I mean, we don't know how to. Well, let me put it this way: science doesn't know how to measure it.
Yeah,
it may be there, but we don't know how to measure it.
But I mean, I guess there's suspicion among people, the sort of neo-shamanic, crowd, that creating these technological prostheses, which act as if, like, a virtual reality could be like taking ayahuasca. You're suddenly plunged into this other world, but it's all a digital reality. That this is actually unhealthy. It's an unhealthy direction, and actually, it's more like the direct phenomenological, mediated kind of investigation that it would be better for people.
Yeah, if we took that direction, if capitalism went the direction of the shaman, we would probably be better off. But it hasn't.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
It can't be commodified. You can't make as much money on that. Yeah, I mean, it could be. We might get around. We might get around to that.
Making dank right now, to be honest. But I just want to
Yeah.
sort of focus on that a little bit. So what's kind of so there's analysis, interpretation, kind of like prophecy or forecasting. But I'm also kind of wondering, because when we discuss this, I feel kind of like like you're not pleased. You feel a kind of like heaviness or a sadness around the sort of extent of these developments and the rapidity of them. And you called your the book the Glossary of Cognitive Activism. So
Yeah.
do you see an activist moment or an opportunity available for people to kind of interrogate what's happening, or maybe
Yeah.
intervene in it, or stop some of it, or something? And how do you see that could happen?
Well, first of all, I think it's. I want to make. I want hope everybody understands that I'm completely against all this stuff. I'm. An activist who is very much, um, uh, trying to create a critique against all this. I'm not a technical. What was the word you used the other day? Technological optimist? Is that what you
Well,
said?
I was quoting the Techno Optimism Manifesto from Martin
Right.
Andreessen.
Yeah, I call that right-wing accelerationism. I'm much more related to, Mark Fisher's idea of left-wing accelerationism, and I'm trying to create what this book was. First of all, uh, for me, was a way of, as I said, it started with my own artwork, but my own artwork had the same value, which is idea of consciousness raising. It's amazing how few people really know what's going on and have these don't they hear words like Anthropocene, or they hear words like accelerationism, and they hear words like I don't know, yeah, like we were just talking about neuroplasticity. They hear all these words, but they really neural divergent. They don't really ChatGPT. They don't really know what they are, and they don't really understand the political consequences of them. So they're allowed to, and the acceleration of technology is so fast that it's beyond even a society's ability to learn what they are and to know. There's the just look at the difference between the digital immigrant and the digital native. I mean, it's incredible. Just looking at that as an example of something that's really real as far as how fast the acceleration of technology is and what it does. So the other thing is, I would like to say, is that I see there's three different kinds of activism. And the Glossary of Cognitive Activism is the third, which I call future activism. So the first kind of activism is the activism of the past. Like, for instance, rewriting American history so that African Americans, people of color, are involved and are engaged and have their history told. And you see all the pushback against that. But that is what I would call, activism of the past. And then there's activism of the present, which is where I'd be surprised if we don't see a lot of women on the streets if Roe versus Wade is not maintained, and we go back to the Middle Ages in relationship to a woman's right to choose. Or recently a strike by the police, the teachers union in certain communities, in California, looking for a pay raise. That's present activism. That's you go on the street. It's very difficult to go on the street. I mean, that's one of the problems in cognitive capitalism, is that it becomes very, very difficult. Except you're maybe hacking, but it becomes very difficult to manifest dissensus. We can talk about that also. But then there's future activism, and future activism is what I understand is the Glossary of Cognitive Activism to be all about. It's like looking into the future, peering into the future, seeing where we are today, seeing how these technologies could evolve, seeing how they could affect our brain, seeing how they could affect what that digitality no longer is just digitality. It's a neural digital entanglement, and that and that our brains are intracranial, extracranial, continuums or complexes that are complexed with this technology. Yeah, so that we have to understand that I'm trying to talk about that and to make it available to people. So that's what cognitive activism, and hopefully, I don't even think I'm going to be the person that can make the changes. I'm hoping that I'm
Your
hoping
your neural link is beeping all of a sudden.
I yeah my yeah I'm gonna not pay attention to that for the next because I have a phone call, but this is going a little bit longer than I thought. But I will let her. I'll call her right back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what my purpose is. My purpose is to give people the language for which to confront these future problems, which I think are real.
When we met a few weeks ago, I'd already been going on a fairly deep dive. Honestly, I didn't really understand that your book was so related to what I'd already been looking into. I'd read Doppelganger, which is the new Naomi Klein book, talking about how she has this sort of virtual, evil twin double in the form of Naomi Wolf. And then from there, going into the whole world of, fake news and conspiracy and how, there's been this kind of like divide, created between so many people in the United States based on confusing information promulgated by people for, kind of for their own purposes. And then I also looked at Internet for the People, which basically is an interesting book. Have you checked it out?
No, I'd love to know about it.
Ben Tarnoff.
Tell me.
So, he basically looks at how originally the formation of the internet was due to, yeah, kind of public funding, scientific research, and so on. Um, and but eventually they kind of handed out the internet. The government sort of just gave the internet over to corporations.
Oh yeah, I know that story, of course.
So he kind of basically argues that there could be a kind of a movement of deprivatization, kind of breaking up the monopolies of the internet companies and creating some type of public trusts for social network, perhaps based on the library system. And then I also read Yanis Varoufakis's excellent book, Techno-Feudalism.
That's
Where,
amazing. He's a genius. I love his work.
yeah, so very similar. He argues that we're no longer in capitalism anymore. We're in this kind of like techno-feudalism.
Yeah.
And, but I actually felt like I was very much aware, like, back in like 2006, I started a company called Evolver. And one of the main things we wanted to do is my co-founder was involved with a think tank in San Francisco called Planet Work. And they had identified way back when that digital identity was like the core issue. That essentially when they built the internet, the scientists and researchers didn't really think about necessity for having a holder of your own identity. So the way it works now is, Google has a part of your identity, Facebook, your bank, Amazon, and so on. Rather, what it should have been designed in such a way that you hold all your data in some kind of secure fashion, and then you choose what aspects of yourself you want to, or your identity or data you want to share with any organization. So that allowed for this whole extractive model where our attention is mined, our kind of our data is continually mined as like the most precious resource of this new economy. So yeah, so I'm still curious about if it's possible to kind of go back and if this could actually be a theme or kind of a plank, let's say, for like a new kind of broad-based social movement, kind of reclaiming the digital commons, rebuilding a information ecology that is non-destructive, because it's not.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just got interviewed by Yves Citon. For those who don't know him, he's a media theorist in Paris, and it's for a magazine called Zero Deux. And I have been kind of talking about, you see, what's really interesting about what you just said is the ethics that surrounds that. And I think that we have, and Bruno Latour has talked all about climate denial, and I think climate denial and what I call eco-agnosia, which I'm not going to go too deeply into, but just to say that, are a result from the same kinds of things, and that they are connected to a whole host of ethical and moral decision-making processes, of which the evolution of the internet, of which you just talked about, the parsing of individuation, the parsing of a digital consciousness, of externalized consciousness that becomes manifest in digital form, so that we have digital signatures. We all know this. We have digital signature, whatever you want to call it. Just like we each have an individual handwriting, which is a signature, we each have a digital signature. And we can go, another time when we have more time, I'd love to talk about that, because it's really interesting in terms of the work of Gerald Edelman and his ideas. But he's a neuroscientist from the Salk Institute. I'd love to talk to you about that, but I don't think it's time for that. But anyway, so in my interview with Yves Sauton, I was talking about my idea of the ecocene, which I think addresses this kind of a problem in a very, very simplistic way. And I realized that, I mean, what I'm talking about is just the beginning, that I hope other people hearing this will think, who have much more knowledge than I, will take and really make it something real. But anyway, I argue that we keep on talking about the Anthropocene. Well, you know, some people just heard about the Anthropocene, but you know, for us who are a little more initiated, you know, I've been thinking and hearing about the Anthropocene since like 2007. And in Berlin, where I was living from 2007 to 2000, I'm still in Berlin, but I was really living there until right before COVID. The HKW was doing a whole 3 or 4 year project on the Anthropocene. So Anthropocene is something that I'm very, very aware of. But I'm arguing now that we have to stop, now that it's become part of the general intelligence, this idea of the Anthropocene. I'm already at this point where I think we can't stop. We have to stop talking about the Anthropocene. Anthro meaning human caused destruction of the earth. And we have to start talking about what I'm calling the ecocene. This idea of technologies, rather, do you remember the talk, what I was just talking about with this 2 million year development that Bernard Stiegler was talking about, of the development, the mirroring between technology and the coevolution of technology in the brain, where the expansion of the frontal cortex. Remember, I was talking about all that. But when you look at those, look at the dominance of certain kinds of anthropocentric technologies that infect those technologies, like slash burning and fire and spear and social hunting, all of these kinds of technologies and these kind of knowledges, they're all about destroying nature. They're not about loving nature, and they are resulting, again, this is very hypothetical and very speculative, but they are a motivating force for that coevolution into a brain in which the architectonics of the brain is anthropocentric. It's an anthropocentric brain. So, and that process of epiphylogenesis or exosomatic organogenesis or neural, or what I was talking about with this kind of neural developmental processes talked about by Stanislavski, whatever, I forgot their name. Those kinds of methods and manifestations, they are still with us. Our brains are still changing. Our brains are still changing. And as a result, I'm arguing for developing ecocentric technologies that love nature, that are engaged with nature, that are symbiotic with nature, that believe in the symbiosis, that human beings aren't at a higher level than plant and animal species, that we are all integrated together and linked together, that if we can develop these kinds of technology, we can change our brain to become an ecocentric brain rather than anthropocentric brain. And that's what I'm kind of trying to do in my art. So I just, yeah.
I guess there's another term similar to that called symbiocene. You know about that?
Symbiosis is a term that I'm using, but yeah, that sounds great. What does it mean? Tell me.
Well, symbiocene would be beyond the Anthropocene. It would be when, you know, we reintegrate back with the sort of natural organic ecosystems of the planet, you know, using our technologies in, you know, holistic ways, you know, properly.
Yeah, so that I call that whole process the brain without organs after Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs. It's a brain that is changeable. It's rhizomatic. It's not incarcerated in the skull, but it's something that is rhizomatically integrated with the world, the history, from the moment of the beginning of the universe and the cosmological dust to the development of technology, social and political issues, microbiome of the gut, the situated kind of embodied type of knowledge. So yeah. So that's yeah, we're on the same wavelength. And yeah, I know you're very involved with psychedelic drugs, as everyone knows that about you.
Well, I
Um,
actually have not been very involved with psychedelics for quite a while, to be honest.
okay, sorry, but you were one of the pioneers of that, study.
Yeah, the car is driving itself now. It doesn't need me anymore. It's like a self-driving Mack truck right now. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's a kind of a nice place to round up. We're talking about an hour. I guess my last question for you is: people hearing this, and they hear about the changing of the brain and technology, and cognitive, labor and cognitive capitalism. And we didn't really talk that much about the precariat, the superordinate precariat. What's kind of more like what can people do at this point with all of this? Let's say they go and they read your glossary and they get all fired up. Where do you feel people can make a productive kind of intervention? Or is it more just having the theoretical tools at this point?
Well, like for instance, I mean, I know this sounds crazy, but like the other night I was at a dinner party, and there was this investor who plays the stock market and is involved in all of these different stocks, technology stocks, and some of them are the ones that I'm very, 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 not so sure about. So I was talking about this stuff about Neuralink. And he said, yeah, well, you should invest in it right away because it's, when I just tell you that kind of thing, it's going to be so important. And I said, no, it's just like I would not invest in arms stocks. I knew that with the Ukraine war, any idiot in America knows that the military stocks are going to go up. But whether you actually invest in those military stocks is another question. So I would never invest myself in military stocks, even though you can make a lot of money. And I would never invest in these kinds of stocks because of the fear. So I basically was at a dinner table and I was able to convince not that gentleman, but like three or four other people what the situation that we're in now. And they were very, very excited and, want to follow up with me. And, so maybe that's how we do it. We do it one conversation at a time.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for having this conversation with me, Warren. And yeah, let's go deeper and talk more.
That'd be
Also, I'm
great.
happy to have you involved with this upcoming online seminar that we're organizing called The Future of Consciousness.
Very.
I'd also be very curious if you have other, people to suggest or bring into the mix for conversations.
I would love to. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
All right, cool. Have a great day, and we will.
Anybody who wants to email me, or connect me on Instagram. I have two